All right, let's talk about one of the most complicated and honestly, one of the most terrifying figures in all of ancient Jewish history. We're diving into the Hasmonean king Alexander Jannaeus. He was in charge of Judea from 103 to 76 BC, and his story, well, it's a masterclass in contradiction.
So here's the big question we have to wrestle with. Was this guy a brilliant nation builder who created this incredible kingdom? Or was he a bloodthirsty monster who just slaughtered his own people? And the really wild, kind of disturbing answer is, yeah, he was both. And this is the paradox that defines his entire reign. On one side of the coin, you've got this military genius, a guy who expanded Judea's borders to be bigger than they had ever been before. But on the other side, a tyrant who alienated his own subjects and kicked off a horrifying civil war. To really get who he was, we have to look at both sides. So let's start with the ambition.
Let's begin with Alexander Jannaeus, the nation builder. Because to understand what drove him, you really have to understand the massive problem Judea was facing the moment he took the throne.
The kingdom was completely stuck. I mean, literally landlocked. It had no access to the sea, squeezed between this crumbling empire in the north and the absolute powerhouse of Egypt in the south. This basically meant its economy was being choked, and it was left totally open to attack from pretty much every direction.
So Jannaeus looks at this map, at this geographic box, and basically decides, nope, not on my watch. His entire reign was just this relentless, single-minded mission to break Judea out. And he was incredibly systematic about it. First, he pushes west straight to the Mediterranean, grabbing coastal cities like Gaza to finally get access to trade. Then he pushes east into Gilead, then north to the Golan to create a buffer zone, and finally south to get control of the King's Highway, which was basically a massive pipeline for tax money. It was a brilliant and absolutely brutal strategy.
And you just can't argue with the results. In just a couple of decades, he took this small, boxed-in, vulnerable state and turned it into a genuine regional power. He secured its borders and its entire economy.
But, and this is a huge but, all of that success on the outside was just hiding this deep, dark rot on the inside. And that rot was about to explode.
Because while Jannaeus was out there winning wars and expanding his kingdom, a completely different kind of war was brewing back home. And this was the war that would end up staining his legacy forever.
So what you have to get is that Judean society at this time was split right down the middle. You had the Pharisees, who were deeply religious and had the support of the common people. And then you had the Sadducees, the wealthy, aristocratic priests who basically ran the temple. Now, Jannaeus, as both king and high priest, threw his lot in completely with the Sadducees, which meant he was alienating the vast majority of his own people. All of that simmering anger finally boiled over in the holiest place possible during one of the holiest times of the year. It's the Feast of Tabernacles, and thousands of people are packed into the temple for a sacred water-pouring ceremony. And Jannaeus, in this shocking act of pure contempt for the Pharisees' tradition, takes the holy water and instead of pouring it on the altar, he pours it on his own feet. The crowd just went ballistic. They started grabbing the citrons, these fruits used in the festival, and started pelting their own king.
Jannaeus' reaction was immediate, and it was horrific. He ordered his foreign mercenaries to just attack the crowd. These were unarmed worshippers inside the temple, and his soldiers slaughtered 6,000 of them. That was it. That was the spark. That one act of pure brutality lit the fuse on a full-blown civil war.
This war ripped the nation apart for 6 long, devastating years. We're talking about Jews killing other Jews, neighbor fighting against neighbor. But even after he finally crushed the rebellion, Jannaeus wasn't finished. His final act of revenge would become the one thing he's most remembered for.
According to the historian Josephus, the death toll from this war hit an estimated 50,000 people. I mean, for a kingdom this small, that number is almost unimaginable. The nation was literally tearing itself apart from the inside out.
So after winning, Jannaeus decided he needed to make an example of the rebel leaders he'd captured. And this wasn't just punishment. This was a public spectacle of pure terror, designed to be so horrifying that no one would ever forget it. He had captured 800 of the leading Pharisee rebels. Their punishment wasn't just going to be death. He chose crucifixion. Now you have to understand, crucifixion wasn't a traditional Jewish punishment. It was a foreign import designed for one thing, to inflict the absolute maximum amount of pain and public humiliation. He was sending a message loud and clear. This is what happens when you cross me.
And this is where the story just becomes the stuff of nightmares. Josephus, the historian, he describes the scene. As these 800 men were slowly, agonizingly dying on their crosses, Jannaeus held a banquet, right there. He was feasting with his concubines, watching the whole thing happen like it was some kind of dinner theater.
But then it got even worse. To inflict one last twisted piece of psychological torment, he had the wives and children of the crucified men brought out and murdered, right there in front of their dying husbands and fathers. It was an act of cruelty so calculated, it is almost impossible to even comprehend.
So years go by, and then, as Jannaeus himself is lying on his deathbed, it seems like he finally understood the sheer scale of the damage he had done to his own kingdom.
His last words, his final piece of advice to his wife, who was about to take over as queen, wasn't about conquest or power, it was about peace. He told her, "If you want to save the kingdom, make peace with the Pharisees," the very people he had spent his entire life butchering. And that right there, that's the tragedy. It was this stunning, last-minute admission that his whole reign of terror against his own people had been a complete and catastrophic failure. So this is what his story leaves us with. A king who built the biggest, most powerful Judean kingdom in history, but he did it through acts of unspeakable cruelty. And it really forces you to ask the question, right? What's the true measure of a leader? Is it the size of the kingdom they build, or is it the unity of the people they lead? The story of Alexander Jannaeus certainly doesn't give us any easy answers.